All right. Well, thank you, Victoria, and for this for inviting me here. This is, as like Victoria said, I've been interested in wearables for a long time, and so it was fun putting this together and actually going through the journey really over the last decade, and that's basically what I'm going to do today. And like Victoria said, there's so much and so many stories and so many learnings in different ways. So what I decided to do was make this probably only about 25 or 30 minutes of slides. And so people please should really feel welcome to interrupt, ask a question, and if you put something in the chat, Victoria, please interrupt or interrupt me. It's totally fine. Um, so the first lesson I have learned from working with wearables over the last 10 years is if you really want to succeed, let's see if I can advance the slide. That's the first step of success. Get an exceptional collaborator. So, so everything I'm going to tell you here has been really done with Sung Choi. She's in the Department of Pediatrics, and I met her actually in 2014, just when I arrived here. I kind of, grew up here as a student and left for 15 years and came back. And Sung has been really outstanding. And I say this not only to honor Sung, but also to just, I guess, highlight how many benefits can happen from really like collaborators that are very aligned with the similar kind of mission and similar, I would say, like value systems. So there have been multiple cases where, thanks to Sung, like a new device came into like, my awareness that I had never even known, or a new funding source, or just new different ideas. So that has been really, really, really important. And like I said, I'll just want to try to tell this in terms of stories, because there's just so much to share, and it would have probably taken me weeks if I was gonna and even weeks to give this talk if I were to highlight everything in great detail. So the story for me begins actually over 10 years ago. And as I was kind of putting this all together, I was reminded that when I first moved here in 2014, I came a kind of mid-career faculty recruit. I was really fortunate because part of that recruitment was an endowed professorship. And I went back and I realized that in that professorship, so this was 2014, these professorship talks, you get to give a talk, and like the first 80% of it was like everything that, I'd been doing, and just kind of even everything from like childhood, even my high school teacher, etc. In the end, it was like what I wanted to work on now here at Michigan. And I went back and I found these slides, and I was really, what was really amazing is I'm amazed by how I never looked at these slides again, but they more or less touch on the topics that we've been interested in terms of research. So I'm kind of using this as my own personal intro, so you all kind of know where I'm coming from, like what our research interests are. And I won't go through all the details here, but I used to work on, and we still work on blood-based, urine-based, all kinds of biomarkers that are molecular. And now these are called digital biomarkers, but at that point we didn't have a phrase for it. So I just called them non-molecular biomarkers. And one of the things we're interested in discovery research. So can we just discover new patterns, new signals? So this is all about, like, I guess the things that we don't already know are associated with a particular outcome, but can we discover new things? And then even can we link them to biological measures and so forth? Another topic that we've been really interested in is, how can healthcare become more proactive? Because there's been this trend, right, from inpatient care to more and more care is outpatient. And now actually this is actually happening, more and more care. I was calling it in the field, but it's really, at home. And so how can we make it so that the healthcare system can be more on demand instead of just, patients coming in just for their regular visits, continuous monitoring. So even doctors' visits could happen, in a more tuned way. And it's kind of cool, actually. Now that I look at this, like this is actually happening in the field now. And then the third thing of interest that I had put out back then was actually do we have the potential of using these wearables to study mind-body interactions? And this dates back to like 60s to 80s. When I was in high school, I read about this guy, Herbert Benson at Harvard, who had published a book called The Relaxation Response. And he was really basically tapping into psychophysiology. And in any case, so this kind of covers actually the three general topics of research. And it was really gratifying to realize we're actually now getting here. So that's the backdrop. I'll pause there for just for a moment, and just in case anybody has any questions or anything. Yeah.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about your collaboration with Sung, like how it started and what some of maybe the challenges were in building, because I know now you have a long-term trusted
Yes.
relationship, but how, because you each come with your own history and perspective and goals, how do you merge that together? And then like as your relationship has continued, do you stay in sync or do you each go off on tangents and then come back? How does that relationship work?
These are just such important questions, I think, and the questions that you're right. People, or I think you're alluding to the fact that people don't talk about. You don't necessarily hear about that. I mean, of course, this is one working collaborative relationship that I can talk about. And again, it's n equals one. But what I can say is the way this all started is I think I moved here in 2014. I was very excited about bringing high time resolution measurements and wearables into clinical medicine. And I had kind of a laboratory scientist background and some computational background. Sung came as a very complementary person who had two things. One is she had deep, actually multiple things, but three important things. One is she came from a clinical bone marrow transplantation background and had great expertise in that and already was doing clinical research in that area. So that was very complementary. I'm a physician scientist. I was doing medical oncology, but I had no real foot in the door of bone marrow transplant, which also turned out to be an outstanding setting because the patients are inpatient just for practical reasons as well. And there's lots of important problems that could be solved with wearable devices. I think another thing that she had was she has deep interest in research. So even though she didn't have a wet lab, she definitely is very, very committed to and interested in research. And I think another thing that was also very compatible is we both have had a lot of enthusiasm. And so I came with enthusiasm, Sung came with enthusiasm. And the way this happened was I gave a talk at the bone marrow transplant like weekly meeting. And she just after that like said, "Hey, let's talk, let's meet." And then it just took off. And then, in terms of collaborative relationships evolving over time, I think those things have been very fundamental to us is that number one, those three things, that we both have maintained our enthusiasm, we both have had a shared vision. And I think that was a big part of it. That when I said, presented my thoughts about I think medicine should be more proactive. It should be more continuous. Sung had already been working in mobile technology, was developing a mobile app, I think, at that time. And so it just resonated. So I feel like it's like shared values, shared goals, and this kind of shared enthusiasm. And over time, definitely, collaborative relationships, they're like everything else, they breathe. So there's been times when we've been working like super, super closely. And then sometimes, we've always been working together. But other times, when I'm busy with other projects and Sung's portfolio is going with other projects, and it just keeps going back and forth. But what I've seen it as is I like to call it a spiral. So sometimes it seems like you're going in a circle and then you come back and you come back. But every time it's building on each other. I don't want to maybe take too long on it, but I think just having in mind like each other's values and goals. And so Sung is always like looking out if there's something that can help me, or the research I'm interested in, I'm doing the same. And I think that it really comes down to that kind of human interaction. I don't know if that answered your question, Victoria, or if you have other follow-ups on that.
That did, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, and then I will just go forward. Okay, so this is actually the first wearable we started with, and this is around 2017. Unfortunately, they've erased the Michigan Medicine emails more than 2 years ago. So I could not actually find my records of when we started working on this. And so when I first started working with Sung, what we thought was we could try to predict graft versus host disease in these bone marrow transplant patients. So they come in, they get a bone, they they get some chemotherapy to kind of eliminate their prior cancer, which also eliminates the bone marrow. Then they get infusion of stem cells, and they stay in the hospital anywhere 2 to 4 weeks. And they're high risk of this disease called graft versus host disease. And when it affects the intestine, they get diarrhea, they get lots of even life-threatening side effects. And so we thought that if we measured their physiology, also actually we thought if we measured their temperature, we might be able to pick up this GVHD and maybe even pick up infections and things sooner. And so we started with this device. And at the time, like there wasn't that much available that was high resolution. There were some smartwatches, the Basis smartwatch, I think Fitbits were out, but we wanted to get as much data as we could. So we thought, this is great. It's this kind of like strap thing, harness thing almost that you wear. And it's got this little box that sits and I think probably Bluetooth, I think, or I forget what the connection was. And that box was a little bit bigger than this, and it measures all kinds of great stuff. And what happened basically was it completely flopped because patients would not want to wear it more than not even a day sometimes, right? And then now in retrospect, and I was quite frustrated over a few months. We kept trying, it wasn't working. And then I went to a conference and a wearables conference, and I found out like people are actually using this, but they're using it in the military. And now if you look on their website and you look at their applications, it's first responders, industrial applications, military, and really training. And the bottom line is like it just was not comfortable. And even in the military, when I talked to somebody who was actually using it there, he said even the military recruits after 3 days refused to wear it. So I think the big lesson I think we learned early on was usability. And if you're bringing any new device, it's both the device, but also the population of interest. And so usability is just so key, and trying to really figure that out early on is so important. So now when we're bringing in new devices, that's like always in my mind. It's like, in this population, is it going to work? Is it not? How many people are going to wear it? How long? And so we're always wanting to do like early pilots to get a sense of that. And what is usability? Well, Gemini gave a pretty good overview. It's not, too complicated, but it's all of those things that have to do with, battery life, comfort, what are all it's like you have almost like take every little practical step of the whole process. And to me, we can optimize it in our minds as much as we can and theoretically, but then ultimately we have to test it. And we're always like often surprised, I guess, by the things that work and don't work. And I personally try to test all of our wearables. If we bring in a new wearable, I always want to personally test it myself, before we put it in with participants. And I think that's a good practice. I'll stop there. I'll just pause for a moment in case anybody has any questions about that. Okay. So then we went forward and we thought, okay, this thing was not very usable. We were very interested in body temperature because these cancer patients, they get a lot of infections. They're very immunosuppressed. So, and by the way, this thing had a temperature sensor, and the whole thing just, wasn't usable. And then around 2018, this startup company came and contacted us. And I'm not going to give the details because there's probably some non-disclosure agreement, or there might be, and I want to be respectful of that. And it's really not that important for the point. And so they contacted us, and they had a very highly usable, very easy to use, very patient-friendly device, that patients could wear for weeks, really, and have no problem, and even had super high time resolution temperature tracking, like every second. It was reading data. It had multiple sensors and all of that. And so we spent about I know I spent at least a year and a half, like working out all kinds of agreements between the university and them, and getting some test devices and trying to, move this forward because it was so great. And then, as happens, with startup companies that are supposed to be rocket ships that reach the stratosphere. This one crashed. They ran out of money. Their investors pulled out for whatever reasons. Many, of course, not in our control. And the whole thing fell apart. And so that is not to say that never work with startup companies, but I personally learned this lesson that working with startup companies, it's really a great opportunity from innovation, but we do need to be doing this kind of risk assessment related to the future of that company. So now when I speak with companies, like immediately I'm asking them, okay, so what's the size of your company? How many units are you making right now? How many units can you deliver? Who are the investors? Are you private or publicly traded? And these startups are almost always private, right? And then even if in that thing, like how much investment have you taken so far? So if they taken like they're like, we have angel investors, it's just me and my garage, someone that's very different than, if they're like, you know what, we've had like, $100 million of investment now over many cycles. And it's not an exact science, but it is something that I think is worth taking to the equation if you want to work with a startup. And they do offer great innovation because, for example, there's a startup that I was in touch with. We haven't really followed up yet, but they have a stick-on EEG device, right? So, you can get like a 3-lead, essentially EEG that's very like user-friendly and all of that. I'll pause for a second and then I'll continue. Okay, so after this kind of blew up, Sung brought me, because she got an email or something from a company called TempTrack, that, hey, here's another way of maybe getting this temperature. And I have to say, in the beginning, I was a little skeptical because this was an axillary temperature. And I thought, oh, it's not going to be perfect. People are moving their arms around and the temperature will fluctuate, which is exactly true. That does cause, errors in the measurement. And also, it wasn't the time resolution I wanted. I wanted to like get really like every 10 seconds or every few seconds, because we had done a study in mice where we'd implanted a sensor that was actually getting data like every few seconds. And this was giving data every 2 minutes. But since our other option was not working, and this seemed like one to explore. And so we decided to explore this. And as we found out a little bit more, one, we found it was that it was actually FDA cleared. And so FDA clearance is a little different. It's not like that FDA has approved it for a particular indication, but in this case, it just means that they have studied this device in comparison to like oral temperature, standard of care, and the data is good enough that the FDA says that it's good enough as another thermometer, and also that it's safe. There's no safety issues with it. And so we decided to start using this device. And I think this is a good example of like it was a device that didn't meet all the requirements I thought I had, but it still has turned out to be a great device for us in terms of success. And the way this device is set up is that you put it on the patient, and we've done a lot of studies in that, both some in outpatient, but definitely in inpatient patients getting bone marrow transplant or CAR T cell, a new type of immunotherapy for cancer. And then the signal can go to the phone, or they have a little box that you can put in the patient's room. It can go there, and then it goes to the cloud and then comes back. In this case, it came back to our research computer, essentially, not to the electronic health record, even though it's possible to do that integration. And back then, I think I wasn't really thinking too far, and I was just like more naive. But in retrospect, it was really good that it's FDA cleared, because later what I realized is once we now do the research, if we want to bring it into clinic, it's in a way it's obvious in retrospect, but I don't know, so many years ago, I wasn't necessarily thinking that far into the future. But once you get the results, because it's FDA cleared, it's a lot easier to try to bring it into clinical practice. And then another thing that we learned from this, though, it goes back to usability. Even though, the company, right, had set everything up, so they had a nice mobile app that the patient could monitor their own temperature. If it got a fever, it would turn red. Otherwise, it would be green. Very nice setup. When we first started doing this study, we just really had a ton of missing data. And then it turned out that this was because you had to have the app running. And if you don't have the app running, it just doesn't collect the data, or there's a certain, whatever, a buffer period. And so we were losing a lot of data. And so ultimately, for the inpatient setting, we ended up using these Bluetooth gateway devices. So nobody has to mess with the app. It just happens in the background. And again, depending on your patient population, these are pretty sick patients. They weren't always going to like sit there every day. That was not a priority for them, right? To check to make sure the app is running or not. So this turned out to be a good thing for the inpatient setting to do it with this. The other thing I'll mention is back then, we did not have any real-time like quality control of what data is coming in or not. We put the patches on, with Sung's team, and then months later, we would look eventually like get all the stuff together and start looking at data, and that was a big lesson too. And so now it took some time, but we started putting in protocols and pipelines so that in more closer to real time, we know, okay, if there's 10 patches on patients, what's the quality of the data from the last week? Because otherwise there can be problems and then you don't know about it until later. Again, in retrospect, it seems obvious, but in the midst of it, sometimes you're so busy with so many different things, we forget to do that. Kind of pause there for a minute.
Rashmi, did you raise your hand? No, okay. I'm glad you mentioned that piece about how often to check the data. With the teams that we've consulted with, we've had people that are like, oh, but the data is way down the road. And you mentioned 1 week. Do you think that's kind of a best practice, so to speak, like at least weekly to be reviewing the data, or is there another like
Yeah.
time period that you would recommend?
I mean, I think it depends on the outcome, you're looking at. So if it's an outcome that happens over months, right, then maybe you can look at it once a week. In our case, we're looking at fever, and the patients are hospitalized sometimes just for a couple of weeks. So if we wait a week, it's probably too long, and we find out the device was not working. So I think a good practical actually is every day, to check in at least. And whether that's a dashboard the company provides and there's a coordinator checking in, or whether you can automate it more. So, we did, one of our data scientists actually spent a lot of time automating everything to give automatic alerts and all of that. It was a lot of work to do that. But that's another alternative. But I think depending on your time scale of when events are happening, if they can happen day to day and not happening over weeks, then probably daily is my view. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this was, though, quite successful, I would say, in terms of our results. So we were able to publish multiple papers, both in the outpatient setting here. This was more a case series. This was sort of our bigger paper showing that if you simply put this device under, in the axilla, measuring every 2 minutes, we can detect serious infections 18 hours earlier than standard of care in the hospital. We can detect cytokine release syndrome, which is something that happens super suddenly in CAR T cell patients about 4 hours earlier. And also this was collaboration with Danny Forger's lab, and there was even indications that in the future we'll be able to detect these infections, these fevers, even before they happen, based on effects, deviations from the circadian pattern of temperature measurement. And so I guess, again, some of the lessons for me from this were just to be really clear on what it is we exactly need and what we're actually after. And when I really look at that, this, what I thought was an imperfect device relative to what I was looking at in the beginning, turned out to be, actually quite good for our purpose. Now, there are other things we want to do with temperature that require higher temperature resolution and all of that, that we probably need a different device for. But it was it was very encouraging, I guess, to see this data. And I'll just show you over here. This is the blue dots are the temp track dots. These orange dots are kind of standard of care dots. And this was actually a patient who was at home, adolescent patient, after getting chemotherapy. And, his, anyways, his mother called in and said she was taking the temperature orally and it was normal or not meeting the fever criteria, but the device was saying there's fever. And mother called a couple times, and eventually they said, you know what, if you're concerned about it, just come in. They came to the ER, and the patient had a big, like, bloodstream serious infection. And it was really good that he came in and got antibiotics promptly. So I think I talked about everything here. Well, I guess one other piece to it is that if you want to, what we're also learning, because we're wanting to bring this kind of monitoring into the actual hospital care as part of clinical care. And that's where having this whole setup is essential. Like the company that you're working with, if you want to bring something into hospital or electronic health record integration care, they pretty much need to have this all set up because there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of IT considerations, a lot of privacy, security, and all of that. And so this is one of the companies that actually does have that. And since then, I didn't have a slide on it, but we've been also in touch with another company now called BioIntelliSense that is doing different kinds of measurements, especially ECG, heart rate, respiratory rate, and so forth. And they also, I think a lot of companies now are starting to really create this kind of end-to-end environment and really enabling that kind of clinical implementation a lot quicker now than it was, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Okay, I will keep going then. And then happened the pandemic. After we had started this study, with TempTrack, and that was all fine. That got published and we got results. And then the pandemic, as some people remember, those first couple of months, we weren't really allowed to go to work, a lot of meetings, everything was canceled. A lot of people were sitting around trying to figure out what can we do to help with the pandemic, and in many, many different ways. And one of the things that Sang and I started talking about and thinking about was actually at that time, this started out with, could we be using wearables, right, to actually pick up who's starting to get COVID earlier. And of course, we were not the only people thinking this way. There are a number of people throughout the country. So we started to actually do this study in University of Michigan students that ended up enrolling like 2,000 students right in the heart of the pandemic before the vaccine. And what we decided to do is to go with Fitbits. And so we put Fitbits on all these students, and it turned into really started with the idea of COVID prevention, but it really turned into a mental health study. So these students over the course of a semester wore these Fitbits, and then every month they did a series of questionnaires and surveys. And they also had a mobile app that Sung's team had developed in collaboration with a software development company. And they did mood scores every day, and we got a ton of data. And this was quite successful. This is one of the papers that was published with Danny Forger's lab. Some of this data went into more like COVID early detection, work that they did. And I think the learning, at least that I got from this, was it comes back to like there's so many factors that determine the success of this study. Because I think we had about 2,000 students enroll, and then we had over 1,000, I think, actually, went for the Fitbit part, and we got data from, and of course, as usual, like there's a wide variety of how much data you get and missing data and all of that. But I think some of the things that were really good about this, and my impression of why this was so successful, was because number one, students wanted to have a Fitbit. The form factor was one that was compatible. If they had an actigraph, and I think Sung had done some studies with actigraphs. I don't know if exactly in the same population or not. It looked very different, especially the old actigraphs versus a Fitbit had kind of a sleek look and so forth. And so the other thing that we learned, I think, through this process was, I think a lot of people learned, right, is that you could actually onboard and do a lot of these things remotely, and it was much more streamlined. Another thing we learned through the process is how do you access the data? And there's multiple ways, and what level of data do you want? And so there's actually like, I'm blanking on the name, but there's a company that pretty much is set up just to give access to Fitbit data. And then Sung's, the app that she developed, they they actually encoded in there. Basically, they could ping the Fitbit servers and get the data through an API, which I learned back then what an API is, application programming interface, so that um, you can actually write code to go and get the data from Fitbit. And that matters because there were a lot of smartwatches on the market, but not all of them could you actually access the data for research. So that's like one of the first questions I always ask, if some new wearable comes along. See, I'll pause there for a second if anybody has questions on that or anything about that study.
I feel like I'm the only one. Well, I am the only one asking questions, but I encourage others to ask questions as well. So my question is more of a longitudinal question. Have You're talking about the usability and such in the wearables? Have you done other studies where, the Fitbit might have been kind of new and fancy at the time you did this study? Has that evolved over time of what the expectation of participants is
Yeah,
in terms of what they receive?
I think it's totally evolved. And because a lot of people have smartwatches already now, right? And if they have an Apple Watch, they're not going to want to wear a Fitbit on top of it. And for example, right? Or they have a more advanced Fitbit than the one, so that's totally evolved. And I think it really matters, and it's so much dependent on the population. So there are other devices, little stickers essentially that go on the chest, just as an example. And in an older patient population, no problem. But in a younger population, sometimes depending on how low cut, the top is, like they might show, and it's a whole issue. Or they might even stick through the, show just like as a bulge, right? Through a shirt a little bit. And so, yeah, it's totally evolved. And I think we can't make a lot of assumptions oftentimes based on something that worked 5 years ago. And it's so population dependent. And then also how motivated the population is. Because the other thing we've noticed, and I think other people have noticed too, is if you can give some feedback, like some of that data. So in this case, the students were also on the app, getting some readouts and getting some information about their surveys, or at least of I think the Fitbit data. And that, of course, is really, really helpful. I mean, this is kind of me on the soapbox, but I personally think we need to evolve our approaches. And I know people who are deep in this field are already doing this, but to make these things more engaging and bring more value to the participants in real time, to actually, both help them and help the research move forward. Hi,
I
Danielle.
have a, Hi, I have a question. So you said it's helpful to get feedback early in the process. How early can you go? Like, could you get feedback even before you really design the study on in terms of which devices to use? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, our first feedback is just within our team. So we're usually, and we consider that pre-research, in terms of the IRB. We're never going to publish any of that. So it doesn't, even though, we are testing it, it's still, at least I see it as still pre-research. And I think it satisfies those criteria. It's evaluating the devices. I think the next phase is tricky, because if you have multiple devices, it's a lot of work to test multiple devices in participants, and all of that. Yeah, so I think it's that balance between resources and making a best guess and then doing a pilot. I think that pilot,
mhm.
5 patients or so. And I this is something I say, it's like, say as I, what is it? Like say as I, do as I say, not as I do, or something like that. We haven't, this is the transition where I would say we're in the process of. Like we started just throwing devices, and then after a while we started doing kind of bigger pilots. And I think now we're like transitioning towards, you know what, we're going to do small pilots, like 3, 5 patient pilots and get a sense. And sometimes put multiple devices and just see. Yeah.
Have you ever done a study with either bring your own device or with a patient advocacy group where you were designing the study with the group during the design phase?
Yeah, we haven't, I don't think so far done that directly, but I know a lot of people are going in that direction. I know Danny Forger has done that with a lot of his work. I know I was talking to Srijan Sen, and I think that they're doing that, in their large studies. So I think it's pros and cons, right? Like I think if it's like lower resolution data on large studies, it makes so much sense. And it's probably the only way you can do it, because a lot of people already have devices. I think the downside, of course, is somebody might have an Apple Watch, somebody has a Samsung, somebody has a Fitbit, and then the integration of those data, has its challenges because they don't always measure the same thing. But it totally depends on your objective. So I think my sense is that I don't want to speak for Danny, but my sense is that they're able to go across platforms if you're wanting to get an estimate of circadian timing, for example, right? But if you're trying to do something it really has to be consistent across patients, it could be more challenging. I would say for a lot of what we've been doing, aside from this particular Fitbit study, we've been really going for like higher time resolution, FDA cleared, different kinds of devices, so it hasn't come up. In terms of involving a patient group, I would really love to do that actually. And I think it's really a great idea actually, kind of moving forward. I feel like a lot of what we've been doing so far has been kind of pilot, but maybe we should involve the patient advocates even earlier. I always envisioned it that we'd get some pilot data and then when we're ready to really roll out, then we do that. But probably we should be doing that earlier. That's a really good point.
I brought it up because it was mentioned by some of the speakers at the symposium. So
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you had done that.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've only done it informally, not in a systematic like focus group type session. Yeah. Yeah. Great. And then let's see, what else can I go? Oh, I guess I have to click. And then here's another study that's in a whole different way, switching gears, so to speak. So this study is a collaboration with Sophia Bruckner. Joe, she's a professor in the art school. Joe Gasho is a professor in the music school, and a number of other people there. And this study is called To Inspire. And really what it is, and it was Sophia's idea at like a university sponsored like human performance, like collaborative thing where they were trying to get different faculty to work on, come up with collaborative projects. And her idea was that when musicians are playing, the most expert musicians have really learned how to breathe in a particular way, and that breathing is very important for them to become such experts. And wouldn't it be cool if we could give learners who are learning how to become experts, the feedback of what the breathing of a real, expert musician looks like, maybe in some virtual format. And so anyway, we ended up doing this study together with Sophia. It's like 31 participants. They would come in and play these pieces. And then the key thing for today is that one of the things that they were actually a smart shirt called Hexoskin, which would allow for measurement of not just breathing rate, but literally I think it's 256 measurements per second of how expanded or contracted is the chest, both the thoracic chest and the abdominal chest. So are you doing belly breathing or not? All of this data. And for this, the types of device are actually these smart shirts. So this is like a children's version here. I think this is the men's version, the women's version. And it's a very sophisticated device with lots of sensors, also has a continuous ECG and accelerometers. And you get lots of data. You can stream it in real time to the iPhone, or you can, of course, download it, or even, it goes onto their servers and all of that. And this is where I think it comes back to like the application of interest. Like I think this would be pretty challenging to put on our bone marrow transplant patients, even though they're in the hospital because they have skin sensitivities, et cetera. These shirts are actually surprisingly, to me, they're very, very comfortable. And a lot of people I've talked to, they're that lycra kind of, sports material. Um, and they offer all of this stuff that I mentioned, really high resolution data. And they also offer real-time data versus stored data. And that was really critical here because what Sophia's group was doing was building a real-time visualization. So as somebody was breathing, like they would have like a visual like circle that would expand and contract. I'm not sure, that was one of the things we were talking about at least. And so if you want to do something like that, this becomes really important, because you might have a device that's even streaming data and there's even a dashboard, but you can't get the data back. So if you ever want to do any biofeedback, that's one thing to realize. And what was crucial here is that they had an SDK. I learned what an SDK is, software development kit, basically, which means that you can have your programmer access, their data, their system. They make certain open source, or at least give you access to the code so that you can actually take that real-time data and then do things with it and display it, for example. And I will also mention that we have to go through the process of information assurance, which we can go into detail or not, but it's a process that, and Victoria is way more expert at it than I am, but as far as I can tell, it's really about information, it's data security and network, like within the University of Michigan IT infrastructure network to keep that secure from outside attacks. And so there is a process for any kind of new device, I think, that interacts with the University of Michigan network, especially, and the exact definitions maybe beyond that. But we ended up, going through that process. Anyone have somebody's got to have some questions. If not, it's okay, but it's just a lot easier to answer questions.
What time frame would you give people, recommend that they start the process for information assurance?
Oh my gosh, I mean, for us, like it's definitely months, like 2 to 6 months, I think some things have taken us even longer. I think now that we learned how it works, and probably on information assurance, the system has learned how it works. It's probably on the order of a few months for us now, but if I were starting this, I'd be like looking 6 months ahead if I could. Sometimes you don't have all of that, that kind of luxury. And so if you don't, I think, you can let them know if you have timelines, and we have to do that in certain cases if the grant money is running out and we really need this, and can you prioritize it? We have to do a lot of those, or at least we did, make a lot of requests that way. And then also being really on top of it, because when they come back with a request for information, being really quick to answer, I think that's really helpful as well. Because sometimes we have been quick and sometimes we haven't, and being quick really helps. Yeah.
That is the feedback they've given me, is that quick responses speed up the process significantly.
Yeah. And I don't know if they still have it, but they have a online, like they have a system for kind of tracking the jobs and the communications and all of that. And sometimes, like if you have somebody in your team, I have someone in my team who really is helping hugely with this, Erin Sanford, but somehow she wasn't on that communication system. And so once I got her added onto that, like everything happened so much faster. So because it wasn't dependent on me to recognize that and figure out the answers. Yeah.
So having a good team member that is available for those kinds of requests.
Yeah, I think it's really, really could be a game changer. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, and then I will just go to, I think, let's see. Oh, I have to click. Okay, so I think this is the last story or case study, however you want to call it. And this is one that's in progress. And this is called the MOXIE study, stands for Multimodal Exploration of psychological challenges in interactive environments. And this gets at that idea that we are very interested in using wearables to study mind-body interactions, basically to have an objective measure of what is happening to physiology in response to stress or distress, different environmental conditions. In addition, of course, to complement the subjective experience of that. There's just been a collaboration now with Annalise Madison, who joined, I think, year or within the last 1 or 2 years, the University of Michigan Department of Psychology. And she's a psychoneuroimmunologist. And so we designed this study with her that's actually quite complex. It was designed as very complex. Whoops, what happened? Okay. And what it involves is participants coming in twice for in-lab stress tests, or stress. So one is the Trier social stress test. It's a classic test where people are asked to give like a presentation impromptu in front of an audience that's kind of stone-faced. It's very stressful for essentially everyone, all humans, because we're very social, I guess, beings in that way. And then there was another one with a political debate stress test that she has come up with, Annalise has invented. So this is like, unpublished. And then we also wanted to do this where we would take measurements when the participants had their own real life stressor, like in this case, this is students, and they were, maybe giving a presentation in class or maybe taking an exam or something like that, in that domain. And I will tell you that we've only really done the in-lab parts of it, because it's a very complex study and we haven't really implemented the at-home. And we just decided to focus on the in-lab because of the complexity, actually, also logistically of scheduling people when they're having a stressful event. But I think the reason I bring this up is this is probably the one where we've gone all out and just put the most number of wearables. Now, of course, it's in lab, so it makes it easier. But there's a lot of complexity that we ran into that we had to kind of learn from in a good way. And so it's a complex study. So they actually use in-lab wearables that are wired or wireless, but they're basically wearables that you would not go home with. It's a whole system, the gold standard for psychophysiology. It's called BioPack. And we also have them wear a Garmin smartwatch, because we want to see, like, how does the smartwatch data compare to like gold standard data. We also have them wear the Hexoskin Smart Shirt. And then we also have them wear this ring that is called the Research Ring. It's from BioPack. It's a very high resolution measurements of lots of different parameters, from a ring-based device. And that's just a picture of the ring. So this is not like an Aura ring that somebody would go home and wear all the time. This is like a very, very high-res psychophys measurement device that happens to be in the form of a ring, and they were in the lab. And it gets like, sweating, it gets pulse waveform, temperature, accelerometry, it can even get an ECG, a lot of data. And so what are the things we kind of realized with this? Well, one is that the complexity of the study, and I guess this is, I guess it's not necessarily related to wearables, but it really speaks to the importance of these standard operating procedures. So in Annalise's lab, Jack Chermside has developed this amazing, like very comprehensive SOP for all of the things that are needed, and even onboarding and training, and that's just so important, we found. And then, with so many devices, we learned a lot. So like one is with the Garmin. So you could get the data just on the Garmin servers, or if you have a mobile app that you're using, right? Depending on the company, we ended up going with Avicenna, which has a mobile app that we're using to do onboarding, to do survey data collection, do ecological momentary assessments. But Avicenna already had an integration with Garmin. So the data goes from Garmin to the Garmin cloud, and then Avicenna goes and pulls the data from the Garmin cloud and pulls it in. And you might say, well, why should I do that? And we are, in this case, we didn't have to pay extra because it was already done. Or maybe we had to pay a little bit, but not so much, because they had already built this integration. So you might say, why should I do that? But in the end, practically speaking, if you're pulling the Garmin data from this database and you're pulling your survey and EM data from another database, putting those together is not like a trivial thing. it's doable, but if you want timestamps and everything overlapping, it's quite, an investment. And that's what we found is that it's much better to just, if Avicenna can already engineer it so that all the data comes in there. And we basically end up doing the same thing with Hexoskin, going through information assurance and then working in it. We actually paid Avicenna to integrate with Hexoskin so all the data comes through there. And so that's one, I guess, thing that I learned is that the more you can integrate all these things just at the back end, it helps a lot. The other thing we talked about the routing the data on multiple servers and then information assurance. And then, of course, information assurance, not just for the device, it's also for the apps. But good news, if anyone wants to use Avicenna, if it's a good fit for you guys, since we went through the process of getting information assurance, and thank you, Victoria. She helped us a lot in walking us through and even introducing us to Avicenna and some background research she had done already. It is already approved, so that'll save you a lot of time if that's the right fit.
Well, and I want to thank you because all of the things that you bring through information assurance, it makes those available to other researchers. So
that is true.
When you're on the forefront and you're trying new things and you're pushing new things, you're improving the research environment for the whole research community. And so that's a big deal. And you take on a lot and your team takes on a lot in order to do that. So I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Victoria. You're very welcome. And we love bringing in new things. So that goes with that. Thank you. And then I'll just summarize in this last kind of slide here. Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left. I just look at this at a high level in the big picture. You have some kind of objective. I think that's so important to define whatever it is for your study. And then if you meet that objective, right, that'll be success. In our case, for example, with our temp track study, our objective was, can we detect fevers earlier in the hospital than standard of care, right? And then you have all these variables that you have to consider. And so I made a list of, it's not comprehensive, but my guess is probably 80–90% of the things that you'll encounter are here. And so if you just treat, I think, each of these things as a variable and just say, okay, have I looked at usability? Have I thought about FDA? Have I thought about data resolution? Have I thought about the real time? It's kind of a checklist, I think. If you go through this checklist, I feel like 80–90% of problems will be at least proactively addressed. And then I have an acknowledgement slide. And again, it's incomplete. So many people along the way have helped in so many different ways. The Taubman Institute has funded a lot of our wearable research. And now we have a pilot grant from the Annalise and I think Annalise got this pilot grant from the Eisenberg Family Depression Center for some of the mind-body studies. And of course, everybody who participated. So I'll just stop there and maybe I'll come back to this slide in case anyone has questions.